What happens when you fall for the one person you can't have? Sophie was the loyal assistant to a billionaire, living by the rules, until she risked everything for love. A forbidden romance, family betrayal, and a choice that could destroy her entire life. I'm your host, Josh, and it's an absolute pleasure to share this story with you. Sophie Lawson had never imagined that a single favor could feel like walking into the lion's den. Not that she'd admit it to Marcus Lockwood, of course. As his personal assistant, Sophie knew better than anyone that he had a knack for finding favors that were anything but simple. This time, though, he'd outdone himself. "Sophie, I know you can handle it," Marcus said smoothly, leaning back in his chair with the practiced ease of a man who owned half of New York City. His office was a testament to wealth, sprawling windows that overlooked Manhattan's skyline, polished mahogany, and artwork that probably cost more than her annual salary. But right now, none of that distracted Sophie from his next words. "It's Gabriel," Marcus continued, as if she should understand exactly what that meant. Gabriel Lockwood. The younger Lockwood sibling, the one who ran through Manhattan like it was his playground, and every headline-worthy stunt was another game. Where Marcus was calm and methodical, Gabriel was impulsive, known for being unpredictable and charming in a way that was equal parts infuriating and irresistible. Sophie clenched her jaw. "You need me to babysit him?" Marcus gave a dry chuckle. "I wouldn't use that word. Let's just say he needs guidance." Guidance. Right. Guidance for a man who probably hadn't asked for directions since birth. "Let me be honest, Sophie," Marcus continued, his expression serious now. "This gala is important. All eyes are on us, and if Gabriel shows up with another scandalous story, it'll only confirm what people think of him. And us." Sophie sighed internally. Marcus had no idea, did he? He had no clue what it felt like to have his life and career hinge on a single choice. But she did. She'd learned, years ago, that loyalty was the only currency people respected. And if her loyalty meant shadowing Gabriel to keep the family name spotless, so be it. "Consider it done," she replied coolly, though her heart had begun to beat faster. "I'll make sure he's prepared for the gala." "Perfect." Marcus's gaze softened just slightly, and for a brief moment, Sophie thought she saw genuine relief in his eyes. "I knew I could count on you." As she turned to leave, she caught her own reflection in the glass walls. There she was, composed, meticulous, a woman who'd worked far too hard to let a reckless playboy like Gabriel upend everything she'd built. And yet, there was a tiny flicker of something in her eyes that worried her. It was the shadow of curiosity, a curiosity she couldn't afford. Later that day, Sophie found herself pacing in front of a sleek Soho loft, clutching her phone like a lifeline. This was where Gabriel lived, though lived felt like an understatement. The building itself was all sharp edges, black steel, and modernity. A striking contrast to the chaos inside, no doubt. Finally, she gathered her resolve and knocked. Moments later, the door swung open, revealing Gabriel in the flesh, and Sophie had to remind herself to breathe. He looked like he'd just walked out of an ad for effortless cool, with his rumpled shirt, artfully disheveled dark hair, and a glint in his eyes that said he'd seen 1,000 rules and chosen to break each one. It was infuriating, and a little bit, well, something else. Ah, the infamous Miss Lawson. His voice held a teasing warmth that was far too easy on the ears. He leaned against the doorframe, giving her a lazy smile that only deepened her irritation. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I'm here because your brother asked me to be," she replied, holding her voice steady. "The gala's coming up, and you need to be prepared." "Prepared?" he repeated, as if the word were foreign. "I don't suppose you mean suit, smile, and say thank you?" "More or less," she replied, keeping her expression blank. She'd perfected this look, the impenetrable professionalism that Marcus seemed to appreciate, and she hoped Gabriel would take seriously. But Gabriel only laughed. Marcus would. He stepped back, gesturing for her to come inside. "Well, if I must be lectured, at least come in and make yourself comfortable." Sophie took a breath and stepped into the lion's den, trying to ignore the way Gabriel watched her like she was something curious and mildly amusing. His loft was a beautiful mess, scattered with art supplies, half-finished canvases, and the faint, intoxicating scent of paint and wood varnish. She could tell in an instant. This was where he felt alive. "So," he said, settling on a couch and kicking his feet up like he owned the world. "What's the plan, Miss Lawson? Are you here to teach me the art of small talk?" Sophie folded her arms, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm here to ensure you don't embarrass the family, or yourself. Is that clear enough?" Gabriel tilted his head, studying her. "Crystal clear. But here's a question for you, Sophie. What's it like to live your life playing by my brother's rules?" The question hit a nerve she didn't even know was raw. She wanted to tell him off, to snap back that her life was none of his business. But the problem was, he was right. She'd spent so much time making sure Marcus was happy, keeping his world in check, that she hadn't stopped to ask herself the same question. "Unlike some people, I don't have the luxury of living recklessly," she replied coldly. "Some of us don't have the freedom to make mistakes." Gabriel watched her, the glint in his eyes turning softer. "Maybe that's your problem." Sophie was taken aback. Who was this man to talk about her life like he knew a single thing about it? But before she could reply, he was already standing, reaching for a paintbrush and turning back to his work as if she'd been dismissed. "Don't worry, Miss Lawson," he said, his voice floating over his shoulder. "I'll be ready for the gala. I promise I'll play nice. Just for you." And somehow she knew that was far from the truth. She knew he'd do everything to challenge her, to push her buttons until she was teetering on the edge of what she could tolerate. Because that's who Gabriel Lockwood was. A hurricane disguised as a man, wrapped in laughter and unpredictability. And Sophie? She was about to find out what it felt like to be caught in the storm. By the next morning, Sophie was trying very hard to pretend that her encounter with Gabriel Lockwood hadn't left her rattled. But even as she went about her usual routine, reviewing Marcus's schedule, firing off emails, organizing meetings, her mind kept drifting back to the previous evening, to Gabriel's loft, and the way he had looked at her with that maddening mix of curiosity and challenge. No one had ever looked at her like that before, as if he could see right through her carefully constructed professionalism to something more vulnerable. And the worst part? She hadn't hated it. "Get it together, Lawson," she muttered to herself, grabbing her coffee and heading into Marcus's office to go over the day's agenda. Marcus barely glanced up from his laptop as she walked in. "Sophie, do you have a minute? I wanted to go over Gabriel's itinerary." Her heart skipped. She forced herself to sound casual. "Of course. I met with him yesterday, and he assured me he'll be ready for the gala." Marcus snorted, finally looking at her with a wry smile. "Gabriel is an artist at making promises he doesn't intend to keep. I hope he didn't charm you too much, Sophie. He's good at that too." The remark stung in a way she didn't expect, as if she'd be foolish enough to fall for Gabriel's charm. But she kept her face neutral, refusing to let Marcus see any sign of weakness. "He won't be a problem," she said crisply. "I'll make sure of it." Marcus nodded, his expression softening just a fraction. "I know you will. That's why I trust you, Sophie. You've always been steady, reliable." He glanced back at his computer. "The last thing I need is Gabriel running off and making a scene. The gala is too important to our image right now." The words were meant to be reassuring, but they felt like chains tightening around her. She'd worked so hard for this stability, this trust. But now there was Gabriel, with his sharp gaze and his maddening questions. And the thought of facing him again filled her with equal parts dread and excitement. For that evening, Sophie found herself standing outside a downtown art gallery, feeling both underdressed and out of place. Gabriel had called her an hour earlier, his voice filled with a teasing invitation to come see the real New York. Against her better judgment, she'd accepted, telling herself she was only doing her job. After all, this was part of keeping him in line, right? As soon as she stepped inside, she was hit by the unmistakable scent of paint and something earthy, like wood and dust. A rawness that felt worlds away from the polished life she'd carefully built. The gallery was filled with people, all absorbed in the vibrant, unfiltered pieces that lined the walls. And in the middle of it all stood Gabriel, leaning casually against a wall, his eyes already on her as if he'd been waiting. "Miss Lawson," he greeted her with a smirk, his voice carrying over the hum of conversations. "I didn't think you'd actually come." Sophie raised her chin, refusing to let him see her discomfort. "I told you, I'm here to make sure you're presentable." He laughed, a warm, effortless sound. "Presentable. Right." He glanced around the gallery, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "So, what do you think? Can I call myself an artist yet?" She looked around, taking in the wild colors, the bold lines, the pieces that seemed to pulse with energy. There was something raw and beautiful here, something that made her feel unsteady, like she was being pulled into Gabriel's world against her will. "They're intense," she said finally, struggling to find the right words. His gaze softened as he looked at his work. "They're supposed to be. Art is like that. You pour everything into it, the good, the bad, the ugly, and hope someone else sees a piece of themselves in it. Kind of like life, don't you think?" Sophie swallowed, caught off guard by the intensity in his voice. This wasn't the careless playboy she'd expected. This was a man who knew what it meant to feel deeply, even if he hid it behind charm and bravado. And for a moment, she wondered what else lay hidden beneath that facade. They walked through the gallery in silence, Gabriel guiding her from piece to piece, explaining his inspiration with a quiet passion that left her speechless. There was a vulnerability in him that he seemed to hide from everyone else, as if he only let it slip through when he thought no one was looking. Finally, they stopped in front of a painting that was unlike the others. This one was darker, almost haunting, with layers of shadow and light tangled together in a chaotic swirl. Sophie felt a chill run down her spine as she studied it, feeling as if the painting was staring back at her. "Who's that?" she asked softly, gesturing toward the figure in the painting, a lone silhouette standing at the edge of the shadows. Gabriel's gaze darkened, and for a moment, he looked almost lost. It's complicated," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's just say it's someone who taught me that family isn't always what it seems." The words hung heavy between them, laden with a pain she hadn't expected to see in him. She wanted to ask more, to understand what haunted him. But before she could find the words, he turned to her with a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You don't need to worry, Sophie. I know why you're here. To keep me in check, right? Don't worry, I'll be on my best behavior." He gave her a wink, trying to bring back that casual charm, but she could see the mask slipping. Something in her softened. Against her better judgment, she reached out and touched his arm, a small gesture of understanding. "I'm not here to judge you, Gabriel. I just want to understand." He looked at her, and for a heartbeat, the space between them seemed to narrow, the air charged with something unspoken. "Careful, Miss Lawson," he said softly, his voice laced with a hint of warning. "Understanding is a dangerous thing. Once you start, you might not like what you find." She withdrew her hand, feeling a rush of nerves. "Maybe, but it's a risk I'm willing to take." His eyes lingered on her, filled with something unreadable, before he gave a slow nod. "Then I guess we're both taking risks tonight." They stood there in silence. Two people from different worlds, bound by secrets they didn't fully understand. And as Sophie looked into his eyes, she felt something shift inside her, something she couldn't explain. Maybe she was stepping into dangerous territory. Maybe this was a risk she'd regret. But in that moment, standing in the heart of Gabriel's chaotic, beautiful world, Sophie found herself wanting to know more. Because maybe, just maybe, he was a mystery worth solving. The weeks leading up to the gala had Sophie's life moving at two speeds. Warp drive when she was with Marcus, reviewing contracts and fielding calls from elite donors, and an unsettling, slower rhythm when she was with Gabriel. Because somehow, between gallery visits, late-night conversations, and the quiet, stolen moments, Gabriel had a way of slowing down the world around him. They were at a coffee shop in Chelsea, tucked into a corner booth. Gabriel was sketching in his notebook, and Sophie, against her better judgment, found herself watching him, studying the way he focused so deeply that the rest of the world faded into background noise. It was strangely intimate, and that intimacy made her feel vulnerable in a way she didn't want to admit. "So," Gabriel said, glancing up suddenly and catching her off guard, "what do you do when you're not, being Marcus's right hand?" Sophie laughed, feeling an unexpected blush rise to her cheeks. "Believe it or not, I do have hobbies. I read mostly. I'm pretty passionate about historical novels." "Historical novels? Let me guess. Epic romances?" "Not always," she said, even as he raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Fine, sometimes. I guess I like the idea of people fighting for something bigger than themselves. There's something heroic in it." He considered her words, his gaze searching, as if trying to find the pieces of herself she kept hidden. "That's funny," he said, his voice gentle. "I'd say you have a little bit of that heroism yourself. Keeping my brother's empire in line, it's no small feat." Sophie looked away, his praise landing somewhere deep within her. She'd always thought of her job as stability, a place where she could keep her head down, earn respect, and prove her worth. She hadn't considered it heroic. She'd barely considered it personal. But somehow, Gabriel's words stirred something inside her that felt a lot like pride, and a touch of longing for something beyond her carefully controlled life. "Your brother's a brilliant businessman," she said, choosing her words carefully. "He's also demanding. But I knew what I was getting into. It's a stable life." He nodded slowly, eyes twinkling with the kind of mischief that always set her on edge. "Stability. I get that's important to you, Sophie, but there's more to life than stability. Maybe you could try something a little less safe." "Some of us don't have the luxury of playing by our own rules," she replied, trying to sound unaffected. But the truth was, she wasn't unaffected at all. He was making her question things she'd kept locked away, like her desire to feel something more, something raw and unfiltered. Gabriel leaned back, giving her a small, knowing smile. "Then maybe it's time to start breaking a few rules. Just small ones, you know. Like sitting here with me, talking about life instead of work. You're pretty good at it." She rolled her eyes, trying to hide her grin. "I'm only here because it's my job." "Sure, Miss Lawson," he teased, letting his gaze linger a second longer than necessary. "Keep telling yourself that." As the days passed, Sophie found herself dreading and eagerly anticipating her time with Gabriel in equal measure. Every interaction was a new layer peeled back, another glimpse into his world of raw creativity, spontaneity, and sometimes reckless abandon. She was surprised by how deeply he felt things, how fiercely he pursued his art, even if it meant clashing with the very family that had provided him with a world of wealth and security. But her growing closeness with Gabriel didn't go unnoticed. Marcus, ever the strategist, had his doubts about the wisdom of involving her with his brother. Sophie could feel his suspicion in the way he watched her, his piercing gaze picking up on details she thought she'd hidden well. "Sophie," Marcus called her into his office one day, his tone cool and measured. "How are things progressing with Gabriel?" "They're going well," she replied, careful not to reveal too much. "He's committed to the gala and promised to keep everything appropriate." Marcus studied her for a long moment. "That's good to hear. I know Gabriel can be persuasive in his own way. Just remember why you're there, Sophie. Your loyalty means a lot to me, and I'd hate to see you compromised." There it was, the reminder of the chains she'd willingly accepted. Chains she'd begun to feel more acutely with each passing day she spent with Gabriel. She'd chosen this life for its security, its stability. But now, as Marcus's words sank in, they felt more like shackles than safeguards. Sophie forced a smile. "Of course, you can trust me." Marcus's gaze softened, but his words still echoed in her mind long after she left his office. Trust, loyalty. She'd built her life around those values, priding herself on her dependability. But what was loyalty worth if it kept her from experiencing life? The evening before the gala, Sophie was with Gabriel at his loft again. They'd been practicing his speech, refining it to avoid any unfiltered Lockwood moments, as he'd put it. She sat on the couch, watching him pace around the room, reading his words with an earnestness she hadn't expected. When he finally finished, he looked at her, his expression both hopeful and anxious. "So, thoughts?" She smiled, feeling a warmth she couldn't hide. "I think it's perfect. You've captured what matters, Gabriel. People will see that." The relief on his face was palpable, and he sank onto the couch beside her, closer than he usually would. She felt the heat of his presence, the unspoken tension that had been growing between them for weeks. "Sophie," he said quietly, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Why do you do it? Follow all the rules? Hold everything so tightly?" She looked at him, her heart pounding as she searched for the answer she didn't even have for herself. "Because I'm afraid that if I let go, if I step outside those rules, I'll lose everything." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering just long enough to make her shiver. "Or maybe you'll find something worth holding on to." The words hit her with a force she hadn't anticipated, cracking open a part of her that had been closed for so long. She was torn between the safety of her old life and the risk that Gabriel represented, the promise of something real, raw, and unpredictable. Before she could talk herself out of it, she leaned forward, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. It was brief, just a heartbeat of connection, but it felt like a spark lighting a fire inside her. When she pulled back, she saw the look in his eyes, an echo of the longing she felt. For a moment, they sat there in silence, the unspoken promise of something more hanging between them. But as much as she wanted to give in, to let herself fall, the weight of Marcus's words lingered in her mind, anchoring her back to reality. She stood, smoothing her dress as if that would somehow cover the vulnerability she'd just revealed. "Good night, Gabriel," she whispered, barely meeting his gaze. Before he could respond, she walked to the door, her heart pounding with every step. She could feel him watching her, a presence as magnetic as it was dangerous. As she closed the door behind her, she knew she'd just crossed a line, one that would change everything. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to go back. Sophie tried to shake off the memory of that kiss. She reminded herself it had been a mistake, a temporary lapse in judgment. But the harder she tried to forget it, the more vivid it became. The warmth of Gabriel's hand lingering near her face, the softness of his voice, the electricity that had pulsed between them. She told herself it had only happened because the gala was near and her nerves were frayed. She was, after all, just doing her job. Or so she kept repeating as she buried herself in Marcus's endless list of tasks, attempting to keep her thoughts as strictly professional as possible. But it didn't help that Gabriel was texting her in the middle of the day with suggestions for research outings. And before she knew it, she'd agreed to one of them. It was Friday evening, and she found herself waiting outside a hidden art gallery downtown, as Gabriel had suggested. She'd worn a simple black dress, sensible but elegant, hoping it didn't look like she was trying too hard to appear unaffected, that is. When he arrived, he gave her that familiar, teasing smile, dressed in a perfectly worn leather jacket and a shirt that looked like he hadn't bothered to iron it, but on him, it looked intentional. He was carrying a small sketch pad under his arm, the corners frayed and worn. "I wasn't sure you'd actually show up," he said, grinning. "Why wouldn't I?" she asked, trying to sound casual, even as her heart thumped loudly in her chest. "Oh, I don't know," he replied, his tone playful as he took in her appearance. "I figured Marcus would have you on a tighter leash." Her smile faltered, and she felt the familiar chains of loyalty wrapping around her heart. She'd never questioned her devotion to Marcus, until Gabriel came along, whispering of freedom, of exploring the world outside the lines. "I can make my own choices," she replied quietly, trying to convince herself as much as him. Gabriel nodded, his gaze intense as he led her inside. The gallery was filled with the kind of art Sophie didn't often get to see, raw, expressive, and unfiltered. The walls were covered in large canvases of abstract, bold splashes of color that seemed to pulse with emotion. It was the opposite of the polished world she was used to, and the change was exhilarating. "Here, let me show you something," Gabriel said, tugging her toward a painting in the back. The piece was striking, a chaotic swirl of colors, with a single streak of light cutting through the darkness. It felt familiar, like it mirrored the tension she'd been feeling inside her own mind. "It's beautiful," she whispered, studying it closely. "It's mine," Gabriel replied softly, his voice filled with a vulnerability she hadn't expected. "I painted this a couple of years ago during a rough time." She glanced at him, taken aback. "I didn't know you painted." "Not many people do," he said with a shrug, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I guess it doesn't fit the Lockwood brand." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, and she felt her defenses start to crumble. Here was Gabriel, stripped of his usual bravado, revealing a piece of himself that he'd hidden from the world. She wanted to tell him that he didn't need to hide, that his art, like him, was beautiful in its honesty. But before she could find the words, he was already moving on, guiding her to the next piece. They spent the next hour wandering through the gallery, Gabriel telling her stories about his life, his struggles, and his art. She listened, captivated by his openness, feeling a strange sense of peace in his presence. It was as if they'd slipped into a world all their own, far from the pressures of Marcus, the gala, and the carefully curated lives they'd both been living. At one point, he took her hand, leading her to a small, quiet corner of the gallery where they could sit on a worn leather couch. She felt his thumb gently trace her palm, an innocent gesture that sent sparks up her arm. And for a moment, she let herself relax, leaning her head back, feeling more free than she had in years. "You know," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "for someone so careful, you have a lot of fire in you, Sophie." She turned to him, her face inches from his, and felt her heart skip a beat. "I don't know what you're talking about," she murmured, though they both knew it was a lie. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," he replied, his gaze dropping to her lips, lingering there for just a moment. "The way you push yourself, holding everything together. It's admirable, but don't you ever want to just let go?" She swallowed, the question hanging heavy between them. Yes. She wanted to let go more than anything, but she was terrified. Terrified of losing control, of crossing a line she couldn't return from. But the way he looked at her, with a tenderness that softened all his edges, made her want to take the risk. Against her better judgment, she leaned in, her breath mingling with his as she let herself give in to the moment. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle at first, a tentative exploration, but it quickly deepened, the pent-up tension between them finally spilling over. She felt his hands on her waist, pulling her closer, grounding her in the here and now. It was both terrifying and exhilarating, and she let herself get lost in him, just for a little while. When they finally pulled away, both breathless, she looked at him, her mind a mix of emotions she couldn't quite untangle. She wanted to say something, anything to break the silence, but no words came. Gabriel looked at her, his expression soft, and reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "I think you're amazing, Sophie," he whispered, his voice filled with an honesty that took her by surprise. She felt her cheeks flush, and for once she didn't try to hide it. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied, his gaze steady. "Just think about it, about what you really want. You don't have to be everything to everyone all the time." The words hit her with a clarity that both scared and thrilled her. She'd been so focused on being the perfect assistant, the reliable, loyal Sophie, that she hadn't stopped to consider what she wanted, what she needed. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter, shared stories, and stolen glances. By the time they left the gallery, she felt as though she were floating, caught between the weight of her responsibilities and the lightness that came from being with him. And for a brief, beautiful moment, she allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where she could be free, where she could follow her heart instead of her obligations. As they walked outside, he took her hand again, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Thank you for tonight, Sophie. I haven't felt this alive in a long time." "Neither have I," she admitted softly, surprised by her own honesty. He looked at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. "Good night, Sophie." "Good night, Gabriel." She watched as he walked away, her heart pounding with the realization that something monumental had shifted inside her. She could no longer ignore the way he made her feel, the way he made her question everything she thought she knew about herself. And as she made her way back to her apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something terrifying and beautiful, something that could change her life forever. But for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to step back from that edge. Sophie had always known how to keep her work and personal life separate. She prided herself on being level-headed, focused, and above all, professional. But now, with Gabriel constantly on her mind and the memory of their kiss lingering like an unspoken secret, she felt like she was navigating a minefield with every step. And the worst part was, Marcus seemed to be noticing. She felt it in the way he watched her more closely, his gaze lingering just a beat longer whenever she spoke of Gabriel. He'd always been observant. She'd admired that about him. But now, that observance felt invasive, like he was seeing right through her. It didn't help that whispers had begun to circulate among the Lockwood family's inner circle. Sophie noticed the side glances from other staff and the raised eyebrows whenever she spoke to Gabriel at meetings or events. She'd spent years building her reputation as Marcus's right hand, someone he could trust implicitly. And now it felt like that trust was on the verge of shattering. Late one afternoon, she was reviewing the final guest list for the gala in Marcus's office when he looked up, his gaze unusually intense. "Sophie, sit down for a minute. We need to talk." Her heart hammered. She tried to keep her face neutral as she settled into the chair across from him, bracing herself. He leaned back, crossing his arms. "I'm concerned about the situation with Gabriel." She forced a smile. "I assure you, everything is under control. Gabriel's on board with the gala and has been working hard to keep things on track." "That's not what I mean." His voice softened, a rare hint of something personal creeping into his tone. "I mean, you and Gabriel. I've noticed that you two have been spending a lot of time together." The statement hung in the air, weighted and heavy. Sophie's pulse quickened as she searched for the right words. "Gabriel and I are colleagues," she replied carefully. Nothing more. Marcus tilted his head, his gaze unyielding. "Sophie, I'm not oblivious. I know my brother, and I know the effect he can have on people." His tone held an edge of warning. "I just don't want you to get caught up in his games. You're better than that." The words stung more than she'd expected. She wanted to argue, to defend Gabriel and the moments they'd shared, moments that felt so real, so genuine. But she knew that wouldn't make a difference to Marcus. To him, Gabriel was a liability, a threat to the image he'd worked so hard to build. And she was just another piece in that image. "I understand," she said quietly, looking down to hide the hurt in her eyes. "I won't let anything interfere with my responsibilities." He nodded, seeming satisfied. "Good. You've worked too hard to let Gabriel's recklessness ruin that." Sophie left his office feeling hollow, Marcus's words echoing in her mind. Gabriel's recklessness. His games. She'd never thought of Gabriel that way, but now she couldn't shake the doubt creeping into her thoughts. What if Marcus was right? What if she was just another conquest, another temporary thrill? The uncertainty gnawed at her, filling her with a sense of dread she couldn't shake. She'd opened herself up, let herself feel something she hadn't felt in years, and now it was beginning to feel like a mistake. That evening, she went to see Gabriel, determined to clear her head and figure out where they really stood. She found him in his loft, painting, his back to her as he worked on a new piece. His broad shoulders moved with each stroke, his concentration so intense that he didn't notice her at first. When he finally looked up and saw her standing there, he broke into a smile. "Sophie, didn't expect you tonight." She forced a smile, trying to ignore the warmth his greeting brought to her chest. "I needed to talk to you." He set his brush down, turning to face her. "What's going on?" She took a breath, steeling herself. "Marcus, he thinks there's something going on between us, and he's not happy about it." Gabriel's smile faded, replaced by a flash of irritation. Of course he isn't. Marcus wouldn't know how to be happy if it hit him in the face. "It's more than that," she pressed, feeling the weight of Marcus's words all over again. He thinks I'm getting caught up in some game of yours." The accusation felt bitter on her tongue, and she hated herself for repeating it. But she needed to know, needed to understand if there was truth in it. Gabriel's eyes darkened, his expression unreadable. "Do you think that?" She hesitated, the doubt gnawing at her. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "I don't know what to think anymore. You've been so different from what I expected. But now, I just don't know." He took a step toward her, his voice low and steady. "Sophie, I'm not playing games with you. This is real to me." His words made her heart ache, but the uncertainty lingered. "But why? Why me?" He ran a hand through his hair, looking almost frustrated. "Because you're different, Sophie. You're not like the others. You don't treat me like some broken, wayward kid. You actually see me." The raw honesty in his voice took her by surprise. She'd never seen him look so vulnerable, so exposed. And despite everything, she felt herself softening, the walls she'd put up beginning to crumble. "I'm scared, Gabriel," she whispered, barely able to hold his gaze. "I'm scared that this is all going to end in disaster." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. "It doesn't have to," he murmured. "We can figure this out. Together." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, letting herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe this could work, that maybe they could have something real, something that went beyond the confines of their roles, their obligations. But as his lips brushed hers, she felt a sharp pang of guilt. Marcus's words echoed in her mind, reminding her of the loyalty she owed, the trust she'd worked so hard to earn. She pulled back, her heart aching with the weight of the choice before her. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I can keep risking everything for us." Gabriel looked at her, his expression filled with both understanding and hurt. "I get it," he said softly, his voice tinged with sadness. "You have a lot to lose, and I'm not exactly an easy choice." The words stung because they were true. He was unpredictable, challenging, a force of nature that threatened to pull her into a life she didn't understand, a life that terrified her as much as it thrilled her. But as she looked into his eyes, She felt the undeniable pull of something deeper, something she couldn't ignore no matter how hard she tried. "Gabriel, she faltered, the words slipping away as doubt clouded her mind. She wanted to say that she loved him, that he'd become more to her than anyone else had in years. But the words caught in her throat, weighed down by the fear of what that admission would mean. He gave her a sad smile, his hand dropping to his side. "You don't have to say anything. Just think about what you really want, Sophie. Not what Marcus wants or what anyone else expects. Just you." With that, he turned back to his canvas, picking up his brush as if nothing had happened. She watched him for a moment, her heart breaking as she realized the choice that lay before her. Did she follow the safe, familiar path she'd always known? Or did she take the risk, step into the unknown, and fight for a love that defied every expectation? As she left his loft that night, Sophie knew she couldn't keep straddling the line. A decision was coming, one that would change everything, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was ready to make it. The night of the gala arrived with all the glamour and tension Sophie had anticipated. The Lockwood family's annual charity gala was the event of the season, attended by New York's elite, including celebrities, investors, and philanthropists. The ballroom was a vision of elegance. Chandeliers glistened overhead, and a live orchestra played soft jazz in the background. Everything sparkled, from the crystal glasses to the jewels on the guests. It was a scene meticulously crafted to project an image of prestige and perfection, but Sophie barely saw any of it. Her mind was racing, filled with a storm of emotions she couldn't control. As she watched guests arrive and slip into their assigned roles, she couldn't help but feel trapped, caged within her own. She'd always been loyal to Marcus, worked hard to earn his trust and protect the Lockwood name. But tonight, her heart felt divided, pulled toward a future she'd never imagined, and a man she couldn't deny. Gabriel was late, as usual. When he finally arrived, he cut through the room like he belonged there, yet with an air that made it clear he didn't care. He wore a sharp, tailored tuxedo, but the messy curls and smirk remained pure Gabriel. He met her gaze across the room, his eyes filled with a quiet determination that sent a thrill through her. He made his way toward her, ignoring the stares from guests and whispers from staff. For once, he looked almost serious, focused, like he had something important to say. "Sophie." His voice was low, filled with a warmth that made her pulse quicken. "Can we talk?" She hesitated, feeling the weight of Marcus's watchful eyes across the room, the familiar burn of her professional restraint kicking in. But the look on Gabriel's face, a mixture of vulnerability and need, was impossible to ignore. "5 minutes," she murmured, leading him out onto a terrace where the noise of the party faded, leaving them in the cool night air under a sky full of stars. He turned to her, the tension in his shoulders melting as he reached for her hand, his touch both grounding and electrifying. "I need to know, Sophie. What are we doing here? This isn't just a fling to me." His honesty took her breath away, tearing down the walls she'd spent so long building. "I don't know, Gabriel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm so scared of what this could mean. If I choose you, I lose everything I've worked for. Marcus, he won't forgive me." Gabriel took a step closer, his gaze intense. "So what? You'd live your whole life pleasing him? Running errands, making sure his empire runs smoothly while you bury your own happiness? That's not living, Sophie. That's existing." The words stung because they were true. More true than she'd ever allowed herself to admit. She had spent years putting herself second, choosing stability over passion, loyalty over love. But now, with Gabriel so close, she could feel that life slipping through her fingers. "What about you?" she countered, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You have your family name too. Why should I be the only one sacrificing?" He laughed softly, a sad, bitter sound. "My family name is an anchor, Sophie. It's kept me trapped, suffocated. But you're the first person who's made me feel like there's something worth fighting for. Something real." Her heart pounded, her head spinning as she searched his face, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. She wanted so desperately to believe him, to trust that this wasn't just some fleeting rebellion against his family. But the fear still lingered, the fear of what she stood to lose if she took the leap. Before she could respond, the terrace doors opened, and Marcus stepped outside, his gaze landing on the two of them like a hawk spotting its prey. "Sophie." His voice was cold, almost icy, We need you inside. Now. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. Of course, she replied, stepping back from Gabriel, feeling the ache of his absence like a physical wound. Marcus's gaze flicked to Gabriel, his face hardening. And you. Try not to cause a scene for once. We're here to represent the family, not undermine it. Gabriel's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with defiance. Don't worry, Marcus, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I'll be on my best behavior. But Marcus had already turned away, pulling Sophie back inside with a quiet authority that felt suffocating. She stole one last glance at Gabriel before the doors closed, her heart sinking as she watched the fire in his eyes fade, replaced by a mask of indifference. Sure, the night wore on in a blur of introductions, polite smiles and speeches that droned on, each one a reminder of the life she'd chosen, the stability she'd worked so hard to build. But all she could think about was the man on the terrace, waiting in the shadows, a flame that refused to be extinguished. Finally, it was time for Gabriel's speech. A few words to thank the donors and guests on behalf of the Lockwood family. Marcus had insisted on it, hoping to project an image of unity, of the perfect family. But as Gabriel took the stage, his gaze flickering briefly to Sophie, she sensed the tension in his shoulders, the storm brewing behind his calm exterior. He cleared his throat, glancing out over the crowd with a wry smile. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's a privilege to stand before you, representing the Lockwood family. His voice held a hint of irony, and Sophie's stomach twisted as she watched Marcus shift uncomfortably, sensing Gabriel's growing restlessness. But as I look out at this crowd, at all these faces dressed in their finest, I can't help but think about what really matters. His gaze darkened, his voice taking on an edge that sent a ripple through the audience. This family has always been about appearances, about keeping everything neat and tidy, even if it means hiding the truth. But sometimes the truth is messy, and that's okay. The audience murmured, confused, and Marcus's face turned an alarming shade of red. Sophie's heart raced, torn between fear and admiration for Gabriel's honesty, his refusal to conform. We spend so much time trying to please people, to fit into these perfect little boxes, Gabriel continued, his voice growing stronger. But maybe we're meant to live a little more boldly, to love a little more fearlessly. His eyes found Sophie in the crowd, and she felt a surge of emotion she couldn't contain, an aching desire to reach out to him, to pull him from the edge of whatever storm he was stepping into. Thank you, he finished, his voice quieter now, filled with a sincerity that made her heart ache. Thank you for being here, for supporting us. And remember, life is too short to live it for someone else. He stepped down from the stage, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Marcus shot Sophie a furious glare, and she felt her pulse quicken, knowing the fallout was coming. But as Gabriel moved through the crowd toward her, his expression soft, filled with quiet determination, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she was ready to face it. He reached her, his hand finding hers, and in that moment, Sophie felt a weight lift, a surge of courage she hadn't known she possessed. Sophie, he whispered, his voice filled with urgency. I'm done hiding. Are you? She looked up at him, feeling the world around them fade, the noise and expectations dissolving into nothing. For the first time, she felt truly free, unburdened by the roles and responsibilities that had kept her caged. No, she replied, her voice steady. I'm done too. And with that, she took his hand, stepping out of the shadows and into the light, ready to face whatever came next. Sophie barely slept that night. The words she'd spoken to Gabriel at the gala, I'm done too, repeated in her mind, each time bringing a mix of exhilaration and fear. She had felt powerful, defiant even, standing there beside him in the glow of that moment. But now, as dawn seeped through her apartment window, reality settled in, cold and unyielding. She'd been waiting for the call from Marcus, bracing herself for the confrontation that she knew would come. And sure enough, shortly after sunrise, her phone rang. Meet me at the office, Marcus said, his tone as sharp as glass. No pleasantries, no softening, just cold, hard authority. We need to talk. Now. Sophie's heart sank. She knew that whatever happened in that office would be a defining moment, a line she could never uncross. She could feel the weight of Marcus's disappointment pressing down on her, and for a brief, fleeting moment, she wondered if she could still turn back. But the memory of Gabriel's eyes as he looked at her at the gala, the silent promise they'd made to each other, anchored her. She arrived at the office and took a deep breath before stepping inside. Marcus was already there, standing by the window with his back to her, the tension in his shoulders unmistakable. The city skyline sprawled out before him, glittering with the cold beauty that had always reminded her of Marcus himself. Distant, powerful, and unreachable. "Sophie," he said, not turning around. "Close the door." She did as he asked, her hands clenching at her sides as she waited for him to continue. Finally, he turned to face her, his gaze cold and cutting, like a blade sharpened just for her. "I trusted you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I brought you into this world, gave you a chance to make something of yourself, to be part of something bigger than yourself. And this is how you repay me?" Sophie swallowed, feeling the familiar sting of guilt, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Marcus, I've always been loyal to you. I've done everything you asked of me." "Everything?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "If that were true, you wouldn't be standing here, playing house with my brother, risking everything we've built for—" "What, Sophie? A fling?" The words hit her like a slap, stinging her with their harshness. But even as her heart ached, she held her ground. "It's not a fling, Marcus. I care about Gabriel, and he cares about me." He scoffed, his expression twisted with contempt. "Gabriel cares about himself. He always has. You're just the latest distraction, the newest way for him to rebel against this family. And if you're foolish enough to believe otherwise, then maybe I was wrong about you." His words were meant to wound, to make her question everything she'd felt for Gabriel. But instead, they only strengthened her resolve. She took a step forward, feeling a newfound courage rise within her. "I've been loyal to you, Marcus. I've worked tirelessly to protect this family's reputation, to make sure everything runs smoothly, even when it meant sacrificing my own happiness. But I can't keep living my life for you. I deserve a chance to be happy too." Marcus's gaze hardened, his face unreadable. "So, this is it? You're choosing him over your career? Over everything we've built?" The choice felt impossible, like tearing herself in two. But she knew that if she turned back now, if she chose security over love, she would spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been. She would be safe, but she would be empty. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I'm choosing him." For a moment, Marcus looked as though he might argue, his eyes flashing with anger and hurt. But then, he simply nodded, his expression cold and final. "Very well," he said, his voice flat. "If that's your decision, then there's nothing more to discuss. You can collect your things and leave. Effective immediately." The words felt like a blow, and for a brief moment, she wavered, the enormity of her choice crashing down on her. She had spent years building a life here, forging her place within the Lockwood Empire. And now, with a few words, it was gone. But as she looked at Marcus, she felt a strange sense of peace. She had done what she needed to do, chosen her own happiness for the first time in years. And that peace, fragile as it was, held her steady. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with both gratitude and regret. "For everything." Marcus didn't respond. He simply turned back to the window, dismissing her without another word. Sophie packed her things in silence, feeling the weight of each item as if it held the memories of her years in the Lockwood Empire. Her nameplate, her files, the carefully curated mementos she'd collected over the years, all remnants of a life that was no longer hers. As she made her way to the elevator, she spotted Gabriel waiting in the lobby, his face etched with worry. When he saw her, his shoulders relaxed, and he crossed the space between them in a few quick strides. "Sophie," he breathed, his hand reaching for hers. "Are you okay?" She nodded, feeling the warmth of his touch soothe her frayed nerves. "I did it," she said softly. "I told him. I chose you." The words hung between them, both freeing and terrifying. Gabriel's face softened, a flicker of emotion crossing his eyes as he pulled her into a tight embrace. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with a tenderness she hadn't realized she needed. They stood there for a moment, wrapped in each other's arms, the world around them fading into nothing. She felt the weight of her choices settle, a strange mixture of sadness and relief. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He pulled back, his hands framing her face as he looked at her with a fierce, unyielding determination. Now, we build something new. Together. A small smile tugged at her lips, the flicker of hope beginning to take root. For the first time, the future felt uncertain, unpredictable, and thrilling. That evening, they returned to Gabriel's loft, a space that now felt like a haven from the world they had left behind. They sat on the couch, hands entwined, sharing quiet moments of comfort and vulnerability. She told him about the years she'd spent keeping her emotions at bay, the fear of losing herself in a life that was all duty and no heart. And Gabriel, in turn, shared the pain of living in his brother's shadow, the struggle to find his own voice in a family that valued control over compassion. Together, they peeled back the layers, exposing the raw, honest truth of who they were beneath the roles they'd been assigned. As the night deepened, they fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, a sense of peace settling over them. And in that moment, Sophie realized that despite the uncertainty, despite the challenges that lay ahead, she had finally found something worth fighting for. She had chosen love over loyalty, passion over duty. And though the path was unclear, she knew that as long as Gabriel was by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. The morning light streamed through Gabriel's loft, casting a warm, golden glow over everything it touched. Sophie lay curled up beside him, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat under her cheek, a reminder that this wasn't a dream. She was here, with him, and they'd crossed the line together, leaving the familiar and safe behind for a world that felt uncharted and real. But as the first stirrings of reality returned, so did the weight of everything she'd left behind. Her job, her stability, her sense of identity wrapped in the loyalty she'd built over years. Now it all felt like a memory, faded and distant, though the uncertainty of what lay ahead tugged at her, filling her with questions she couldn't quite silence. Gabriel shifted, his arm wrapping around her protectively as he blinked his eyes open, a lazy smile stretching across his face. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Good morning," she whispered back, her heart doing a little flip at the warmth in his gaze. It felt so easy, so natural, to be here with him. Yet, the doubts lingered, hovering like shadows. He seemed to sense it, his smile fading as he gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're thinking too hard," he said softly, his tone laced with affection. She sighed, biting her lip. "It's just, this is all so new. I walked away from everything I've ever known. Everything I thought I wanted." Gabriel nodded, his expression thoughtful as he traced patterns on her hand. "I know, and I can't tell you what the future holds, Sophie. But I can tell you that I'm not going anywhere. Whatever happens, we're in this together." The conviction in his voice steadied her, soothing the fears she hadn't even put into words. She hadn't expected Gabriel to be the anchor she needed, the one who kept her grounded while offering her the freedom she'd always craved. And as she looked at him, she felt a quiet certainty begin to take root, a sense that maybe this was exactly where she was meant to be. They spent the morning in a comfortable rhythm, making breakfast together, laughing at the mess they made in the kitchen, and talking about the little things that filled their lives. She realized how little time she'd spent on herself in the past few years, always focused on Marcus's goals and ambitions, pushing aside her own dreams in the process. Gabriel, it turned out, was a surprisingly good listener. He asked her about the books she loved, the places she wanted to visit, and the things she'd always dreamed of doing but never dared to try. And with each answer, she felt a little more of her old self coming back to life, a version of herself she'd thought she'd lost. It wasn't until the afternoon, as they sat on the couch with their fingers intertwined, that Gabriel brought up the question she'd been dreading. "So," he said, his gaze steady, "what's next for you, Sophie? Now that you're free." The word hit her with a bittersweet pang, a reminder of both the liberation she'd chosen and the sacrifice it had required. She'd given up the career she'd built from the ground up, the security she'd always leaned on. But in its place, she felt a new kind of strength, a quiet, resilient confidence that came from choosing her own path. "I don't know," she admitted, a small smile playing on her lips. "I spent so long defining myself by what I did for Marcus, by the role I played in his life. I think it's time I figured out who I am outside of that." Gabriel squeezed her hand, his smile filled with pride. "I have a feeling you're going to surprise yourself." They spent the rest of the day exploring the city together, walking through neighborhoods she'd never taken the time to visit, discovering hidden cafes and art galleries, savoring the simple, stolen moments that felt like little victories against the world. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, unburdened by expectations, free to simply exist in a world that felt like their own. As night fell, they returned to the loft, the soft glow of the city lights filling the space with a gentle warmth. Gabriel poured them each a glass of wine, and they settled on the couch, wrapped in each other's arms as they watched the city sparkle below. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. She shook her head, her gaze steady as she looked at him. "No, I thought I would, that I'd miss the stability, the routine. But all I feel is free." He leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "Good, because I want this to be a beginning, Sophie. For both of us. No more hiding, no more pretending. Just us." She smiled, feeling the warmth of his words settle over her like a promise. They had chosen each other, against all odds, against the world that had tried to keep them apart. And in that choice, they'd found something real, something worth holding on to. As they sat there, wrapped in each other's warmth, Sophie felt the last of her fears melt away, replaced by a quiet, unshakable confidence. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she was ready to face it on her own terms. Because she'd found something far more valuable than stability, something that filled the emptiness she'd carried for so long. She had found love, a love that was worth every sacrifice, every risk. And that was a future she was finally ready to embrace. Months had passed since that night at the gala, but to Sophie, it felt like a lifetime. She stood in the middle of Gabriel's studio, watching him work with a focus she'd come to love. The loft had transformed in recent months, not just with more of his artwork filling the walls, but with pieces of her life sprinkled everywhere. Her books, the coffee mugs she insisted on collecting, and the comfortable blanket they argued about who got to use on chilly nights. What had once been a space of quiet solitude for Gabriel had become a home for both of them, filled with laughter, shared meals, and a gentle understanding that grew stronger each day. She'd left her old life behind, but instead of feeling lost, she felt whole. It was a feeling she hadn't expected, and one she held on to tightly. As Gabriel worked on his latest piece, a striking swirl of colors she couldn't quite decipher, Sophie sat on the couch, her laptop balanced on her knees as she typed away. She'd recently taken a position with a small nonprofit, a complete departure from the corporate life she'd known, but a change that felt like stepping into her own. Her new work was quieter, less about power and prestige, and more about purpose, helping people, building something meaningful from the ground up. For the first time, her work was a reflection of herself, not an extension of someone else's ambition. Gabriel paused, glancing over at her with a small smile. "How's it going?" "Pretty well," she replied, feeling a surge of pride. "We just hit our fundraising goal for the quarter." He set his brush down and crossed the room to sit beside her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. "Look at you, my very own world changer." She laughed, nudging him playfully. "It's not that impressive. I just answer emails and organize fundraisers." He tilted her chin up, his eyes soft. "You're doing what you love, Sophie. That's impressive. It's inspiring, actually." The sincerity in his voice warmed her, and she felt a sense of peace settle over her. Gabriel had become her biggest supporter, cheering her on through every uncertain step of this new journey. He'd given her the space to grow, to find herself outside of her past life, and that freedom had been both terrifying and exhilarating. "And you?" she asked, looking over at his painting. "What's this one about?" He chuckled, running a hand through his hair. "Honestly, I'm not sure yet. It's different, but I think that's a good thing." She studied the painting, trying to understand its meaning. The colors were wild, chaotic, a mix of dark blues and vibrant golds that seemed to clash and harmonize at the same time. It was like watching two opposing forces finding balance, creating something beautiful out of their differences. "It's us," she said softly, surprising even herself with the realization. He raised an eyebrow, glancing at the painting and then back at her. "Us?" She nodded, feeling a quiet conviction settle over her. "We're different, Gabriel. We're messy and imperfect, but we balance each other. And that's what makes us real." He looked at her, his expression softening as he took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "I like that. Messy and imperfect. Sounds like the best kind of life." They sat there in comfortable silence, the weight of their journey settling over them like a warm embrace. They'd each walked away from expectations, from the roles they'd once thought defined them. And in doing so, they'd found something that went beyond the surface. A love built on understanding, on acceptance, on the freedom to be exactly who they were. Sophie thought back to her life before Gabriel, the rigid, predictable path she'd once followed. She'd been safe, but she hadn't been alive. Now, every day was filled with uncertainty, with challenges and moments of doubt, but it was a life she'd chosen, a life that felt worth living. They had a future ahead of them, one that was unwritten, filled with unknowns. But for the first time, she felt no fear. She was standing on solid ground, anchored by love and the knowledge that she'd found something worth holding on to. Gabriel looked at her, a spark of mischief in his eyes. "So, are you up for a little adventure?" She grinned, feeling a familiar thrill as she leaned into his side. Always. They spent the rest of the evening planning an impromptu trip, something spontaneous and bold, a promise to keep their lives filled with the kind of freedom they'd found together. It would be a chance to see the world, to find inspiration in new places, and to create memories that would shape the life they were building side by side. As they packed, laughing and teasing each other over whose suitcase was more impractical, Sophie felt a quiet joy settle over her. She'd spent so much of her life chasing stability, clinging to routines and expectations. But now, with Gabriel by her side, she'd found something more precious than security. She had found love, wild, imperfect, and real. And that was all she needed. They stepped out of the loft, their fingers intertwined, ready to face whatever the world had in store. Together they were unstoppable, two souls who had defied the odds to find each other. And as they walked into the night, Sophie knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. If you liked the video, subscribe to the channel. Your subscription will show that I'm on the right path to bring you the best videos ever. Check this video out too. This small-town baker thought she won the opportunity of a lifetime. But what if it was all a lie? Claire steps into a world of billionaires, private beaches, and insane luxury, falling for Daniel Sinclair, a billionaire who seems perfect, until she discovers the truth.